The second sophistic, we have to remember, is a very small, very elite, very male group, but we haven't asked whether there are other narratives that are running at the same time. And that's a big part of what I think my book is trying to do, is show that there is another narrative.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. There's an old chestnut that ancient Greek literature more or less died when Philostratus did, so in the year 230 of the Common Era. Philostratus was the author of, among other weird works, a Lives of the Sophists, in which he recorded biographies of 42 so-called sophists, or intellectuals, and made famous the idea that the last couple of centuries had marked a second great flourishing of Attic letters, that is, a second sophistic. Modern classical scholars didn't used to be too interested in the texts, and there are lots of them that survive from that era. But that all changed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when scholars, most famously Glenn Bowersock and Ewan Bowie, began taking the period seriously as one of real intellectual flourishing. The second sophistic had long been seen as yet another period of decadence, but this new wave of work began to recognize the evidence for it as attesting to a complex cultural phenomenon. That phenomenon was strongly marked by classicism, and by Atticism in particular, and played a significant role in negotiating Greek identity under Roman rule. A lot of new insight has, of course, been gained over the last 65 years. More recently, scholars have been expanding their scope beyond the elite male sophists of the period to consider the broader participation of other groups, including women, freedmen, and non-Greeks, in its cultural dynamics. There's also been increased attention to the religious and cultic life of the era, and this was, of course, the backdrop against which Christianity emerged. And finally, lately scholars have also been moving beyond a strict Greeks versus Romans binary in an attempt to consider the interconnected Mediterranean world more holistically. My guest for this episode, Lindsey Mazurek, or Linny as you'll be hearing me call her, wrote a book a few years ago that impressively takes on all of these new directions. That book is called Isis in a Global Empire, Greek Identity Through Egyptian Religion and Roman Greece, and I think that title immediately tells you how wide-angle Linny's lens is. What I found really fascinating about this book was how Linny uses the whole range of evidence for Isis worship to construct an elegant argument about alternative models for the formulation and performance of Greek identity during and under the Roman Empire. For Isis worshippers, the past point of reference was not that first sophistic back in classical Athens, but rather the deeper, more abstract, but also more capacious Homeric past. That is, the point of origin for the gods and their dealings with mortals. Linny's account of this alternative model of Hellenism, a Hellenism that is not obsessed with purity and expelling foreign elements, but which is instead ecumenical and all-encompassing, actually brought me back to thinking about concepts in modern Greek studies. In that field, there's been a huge amount of work on the competing and complementary modern notions of Hellenism, especially the ones that jostled with each other in the era of Greece's War of Independence. And that all might be a little too off track for a podcast on ancient Greece, but for me, that connection marks another illustration of just how exciting Linny's work is and in how many different directions it's exciting. This episode is another long one. During it, you're going to hear Linny talk a little bit about a chapter on recreations of Nilotic landscapes that she says got away from her because she was just so fascinated by the material. I think something like that happened to me with this episode, which got away from me because both the subject material and Linny's approach are so mesmerizing. And in the future, I will be trying to keep the episodes under an hour. Lindsey Mazurek is an assistant professor in the Department of Classical Studies at Indiana University. Her research focuses on the intersections of ethnicity, religion, migration, and material culture in the Roman provinces, particularly Greece. She's the author of Isis in a Global Empire, Greek Identity Through Egyptian Religion in Roman Greece, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2022. She also co-directs the Mediterranean Connectivity Initiative, a digital history and archaeology project that examines social ties in Rome's port cities. Her work has appeared in the American Journal of Archaeology, Hesperia, and the Memoirs of the American Academy at Rome. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. And yet another little reminder that Lesche is on Instagram. The handle is @Lesche Podcast, and I will be posting a small carousel of images that accompany this episode. For now, though, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Lindsey, aka Lindsey Mazurek. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
So I originally started my PhD with the dream of becoming a person who studies Roman Egypt. I had taken some graduate courses from Chris Hallett and got really into mummy portraits and was really excited about them as sort of this nexus where we could think about provinces and religion and the idea of the foreign all together. But when I got to graduate school, it became clear that that was not really a viable path for me to go down, and I was kind of casting about for something, and then I did the American School summer session, and we went to Dion, and I saw the Isis sanctuary there, and I said, this is where I can kind of ask these questions, explore this area, and bring my Egypt interest into it without totally abandoning my burgeoning interest in the provinces. So from there, luckily I had studied French as a child, because it turns out this is a Francophone dominated field. So I spent a lot of time really beefing up my French, reading a lot of inscriptions, and I became really interested in sort of this broader question around what does it mean for somebody who's living in Roman Greece, particularly in this period where the question and the anxiety around Greekness and its connection to the past and its purity is so prominent among elites. What does it mean for someone like that to pick up Egyptian religion? What are the cultural valences and baggages intersecting into that choice? So I got really excited about all of those things, and typical graduate student fashion, decided I was going to try to tackle it from every single angle possible. And when it came time to turn the dissertation into a book, I had a really valuable meeting with Anne-Marie Yason at USC, where I had written out this book proposal. I gave it to her, and she took a look at it. She said, "This isn't the book you want to write, actually. I can tell from reading this that this is actually not the question you're interested in." And it really forced me to think about, okay, so what, if this book is going to be mine, if this book is going to be about what I'm interested in, what's the question? And so really pushed me to reframe it around Greekness and around the formation of Greekness and around this question of minority identity in Roman Greece. And so that ended up being the perspective I took, with Isis more as the body of evidence I was questioning than necessarily the driving force behind the book.
So in terms of these Egyptian gods, because the book's about Isis, but also there's a lot on Serapis. Mm-hmm. Right? I guess these are the two main Egyptian gods in your story. How did you start going about addressing this question that you had of, like, how do these gods come to figure into the construction of Greek identity in a very complicated period?
I think the first thing I really latched onto was sort of the literary component. When you start a new project, everyone always asks you, like, oh, have you read like this one thing? And there were kind of two things that people asked me about. One was Elizabeth Walter's book on the funerary release from Athens, which obviously played a big role in one of the chapters. But the other one was Grant Parker's Gift of the Nile. And I became really inspired by the way that he was treating that question there of what's the role of Egypt in this imagination of classical Greek literature. So that inspired me to think about what it might look like in this later period, and how these literary constructs that we see, particularly in people like Plutarch and Apuleius, are telling us something more about what the cultural imagination is of Egypt at that time. Because when you dig into the literary and archaeological evidence, it's really hard to pull apart the place of Egypt and the fantasy of Egypt from these characters. In many ways, that's a dissertation project free to a good home if somebody's looking for one, is that trying to figure out what is there a separation or isn't there. So for me, it became really interesting to see the different ways that different authors, and particularly authors of epigraphic hymns, were interested in this problem of Isis's origins and how they kind of tried to deal with this problem of the fact that she has to be from Egypt. Because if you take that away, she doesn't really make any sense. But they needed her to be some way deeply grounded in Greece. And so you get these stories in which she's taking on these duties and responsibilities and powers that are so obviously tied to very specific Greek gods in the canon, even like back to the Homeric hymns. And, try to negotiate her connection to the Greek landscape as well. So there's a lot of really creative adaptation strategies that sort of formed the core of my first foray into this body of material.
Yeah, I want to come back to this concept of deterritorialization that you bring up. But before we do that, maybe you could speak a little bit about, okay, so you are with the American School, you're in Dijon, you see sanctuaries, and you're inspired. What do you do next? Like what kind of sources do you start looking at? What are the sources that you find there to be for Isis or Serapis in the Greek world? Because I think that this book is unusual in a wonderful way in that you're looking at kind of every piece of evidence, that you're not limiting yourself to the material record or the literary record or the epigraphic, but you're really trying to put together a comprehensive picture. So yeah, what is the variety of sources, and like how did you go about sifting through them and making sense of how you were going to organize them?
I think at the initial point, since my background is more on the archaeological or historical side, I was just literally just trying to find excavation reports for every single site that I could find where there was a sanctuary to Isis or Serapis, or they're the main two deities there. So that brought me, pretty deep into some particularly old French excavation reports. But it also became clear as I was looking through the material that the epigraphic material was so rich on this particular field. And Laurent Bricault, who's a French scholar, has put together these really useful compendia. This is amazing, a specific corpus of just inscriptions related to Isis and Serapis that were super useful to me and allowed me to get a really good sort of grasp on the epigraphic habit of this particular cult, some of its idiosyncrasies, as well as how it ties into sort of broader patterns really, really easily. And from there, I ended up kind of actually going out into the literature. So I spent a lot of time kind of starting with the material and then moving outward. And there just were some themes that kept reoccurring to me as we looked across, particularly themes of classicism, of relationships to the past, of universalism, of geography that really came to the forefront for me as I tried to work through all of this different material and bring it together into a coherent picture.
What are the literary sources? I guess I'm a literary person, so that's what I'm going to ask you first. Because when you said that everybody says, oh, have you read this? I thought that maybe you were going to say, oh, Plutarch, Isis and Osiris, that I was thinking more ancient. So what are the big ones?
I mean, for the Roman period, the two most directly tied to Greece are Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris, which is a wild ride. Truly
Can you say
amazing.
A little bit about that? Like, what's in that?
Plutarch is trying to give you a sense of the mythology and origins of Isis and Osiris, but really what he's actually getting at is he's trying to get at that middle Platonic problem of what is the nature of deity, what is the nature of unity and universality. And so in a lot of ways, my interpretation of that text anyways, is that what we're really seeing there is an attempt to use the mythology of Isis and Osiris, which he knows. I think it's fairly clear that at least among educated elites in the Second Sophistic, they have a sense of some of the big myths that were popular at the Ptolemaic court. He's trying to use that to solve an unsolvable problem in Platonic philosophy, which is how do we make these gods singular and one when they are by nature disparate? And so Isis and Osiris, because of their theology that's sort of brought out of Egypt, it's this thing that scholars of ancient religion call henotheism, which is this idea that there is one God, but actually it's made up of all these different avatars, so to speak, is incredibly useful for him in that Platonic project. And I won't pretend to be a Platonic philosophy expert in any way, shape, or form, but it's clear to me that that's at least a big part of what Plutarch's trying to do with that one.
Yeah, maybe we could just pause there for a moment. And could you explain the difference between henotheism and monotheism?
Yeah, so henotheism is a kind of an idiosyncratic thing in a lot of ways, but it really has this idea of the gods as having multiplicity innate to them while putting certain deities at the top of the hierarchy. So in the case of Isis, she's often referred to as the mother of the gods, sort of the progenitor, and it often takes the form of her in the Greek texts anyways. She'll be described as the one that comes up with laws and writing and also dictating that children should love their parents and that husbands should love their wives and wives should love their husbands, and that she's creating agriculture. So she just sort of gets credited with all of this. And this echoes what we see in sort of Ptolemaic Egyptian religion, where Isis over time is subsuming all of these more traditional Egyptian goddesses like Bastet and Hathor into her persona. And so kind of by the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she really is the most important deity, the central deity, the most powerful and important one, even though, at the beginning, she really hadn't been that central. She's the one that the Ptolemies kind of promulgate more than others.
Okay, great. And so you said the other big text for this is Apuleius. What are we looking at with Apuleius?
Apuleius, though we mostly think of him as a novelist because of the prominence of the Metamorphoses, which is his big 2nd century novel, in his own lifetime was more renowned as a Platonic philosopher. And so the last book of the Metamorphoses is called the Isis book, book 11, and there our protagonist, Lucius, who spent 10 books wandering around as a donkey, going through various trials and tribulations, arrives at Kenkreae, which is a port of Corinth, and he has a miraculous dream of Isis where she talks to him, and then he sort of joins her cult, is changed back into a person, and then spends the rest of the book going through the various processes of initiation and rising through the cultic ranks. There's, of course, lots of problems with Book 11, the tone problem, essentially, where Book 1 through 10 are pretty obviously supposed to be funny, and Book 11, is it supposed to be funny or is it not? I think even if it is a joke, it's a joke that relies on the truth to be funny. It's a joke that relies on Apuleius having a pretty decent idea of at least the more public parts of the cult. He seems pretty knowledgeable. There's a passage at the beginning where he's speaking to Isis, or Lucius is speaking to Isis, and it's a pretty clear adaptation of epigraphic hymns that we have from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. The descriptions that he gives of the cult and its sort of architecture, material culture, more or less reconcile with what we can find in the archaeological record and epigraphic record. So even if it is a joke, it's more of a John Stewart kind of satire than something that's totally, completely off the wall and made up.
So Apuleius, according to the typical chronology, right, is born right about when Plutarch dies. So we're not going to postulate that they're friends or anything. But are there texts mutually legible? I mean, do they seem to be on the same page about anything?
I think they are. Kendra Eshleman's book on the world of the second sophistic kind of puts them both in the same intellectual, I guess, family tree of Middle Platonists that are active in Athens. We do know Apuleius spends quite a decent amount of time in Greece. The hymn I mentioned does appear in various sort of incarnations in both of their texts. They're in somewhat of the same social milieu, but they're definitely familiar with, at least, if they're not both actively involved in the cult, they're familiar with the same information about the cult that I think was actually fairly easily available. I don't think this cult is as secret as it wants you to believe it is.
So can you say a little bit more about the corpus of hymns? What does that look like?
So we have, I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how many of them we have. I think it's around 10 of these hymns from around the Eastern Mediterranean. Most of them are from Greece. There's one from Maronia, there's one from Andros, there's one from Cassandrea, there's one from Kyme in Asia Minor, which is our most complete one. They date from about the 1st century BCE, and copies of them kind of appear until about the 3rd century. And they're pretty remarkable. I wish every
these are inscriptions. They're inscribed.
Yes, they're inscribed.
Right, okay.
And so we know from Kyme that they all sort of appear on these big stelae. The one at Kyme is actually found in the sanctuary, which does suggest that they are used within the cult for some purpose or another. It's possible that they're used for initiation rites in some capacity, that people would read them. It's interesting because they're actually composed in the first person or the third person most often. So people would be reading saying, I am Isis, or you are Isis. Sorry, second person, not third person. So there's something about where they either are embodying the persona of the goddess while reading it, or coming face to face with the divinity. So it's promoting a very particular type of personal soteriological relationship between human and divine. They tend to give you really useful information that you wish you had for every god. Like, she's the daughter of Cronus sometimes, and sister of Serapis and mother of Harpocrates. That describes the things that she's done, and they're pretty consistent. There are some changes from site to site where you have things like, you are the one who invented laws, along with Hermes is a common one. Then sort of describes her, often thanks her for some sort of special miraculous interaction that she's done. And so the texts themselves really do give almost like a Nicene Creed style just definition of who Isis is. There's a couple that are dedicated to Serapis. There's one on Delos. And there's one at Helkis that's dedicated to Harpocrates. It's a little bit unusual. But they really are pretty consistent. And I think that they do serve a ritual didactic function. And these are the same ones that are then adapted into Second Sophistic literature. So I don't think that they were very secret. I think people pretty much knew about them. And they were fairly easily accessible to people who may not have been fully initiated into the cult.
So you're saying Isis and Serapis, sister, brother, Serapis on Delos. For me, this is giving Artemis Apollo. And I guess you would say, okay, well, let's not do Interpretatio Graeca for everything. But we're talking literally about Interpretatio Graeca in the ancient world. Is that kind of the vibe that, does that enter into it at all? Or is that just coincidental?
I think the reason it shows up on Delos is more historical than anything else. The one that we have from Delos is kind of, again, an amazing text I wish we had for every sanctuary that gives us a myth history of how that cult group got founded. And it tells us there's a guy named Apuleius, who's a priest from Memphis, who tucks a cult statue under his arm, gets on a boat, and comes to Delos. Exactly why he does that is debated, but he does go there. They found this sanctuary. They get into a dispute that involves like a lawsuit and a senatus consultum. And then miraculously Serapis steps in. But what's kind of interesting is that stuff it ends by the end of the 1st century, and there's a real shift around then from Serapis kind of being the center of the cult to Isis being the center of the cult. She takes on significant prominence sort of after that point as the cult kind of becomes more widespread, perhaps more connected in a lot of ways because of these hymns. So Serapis kind of doesn't really have much of a personality beyond that period. He kind of just is there. He has a nice beard and some great statues, but he doesn't really take on, neither one of them has a really distinct personality from the other, which is kind of interesting. They're in many ways very empty semas.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Well, I have so many questions, but let me ask you to wrap up maybe talking about this evidence. So what other, besides hymns, what other epigraphic evidence is there?
We have a lot of epigraphic evidence for various dedications, commemorations of people. So there's a pretty rich, robust body of honorific decrees, people mentioning it in funerary inscriptions. It's a pretty solid, I'm looking at my bookshelf now, and it's, a solid 6-inch set of epigraphic volumes I've got over there. They're just Isis and Serapis from around the Mediterranean, apart from Egypt. So there's a pretty developed priestly hierarchy that does seem to be place to place, and there's some interesting sort of holdovers that may come over from Egyptian religion. For example, there's a sanctuary to Isis on the south slope of the Acropolis where there's a woman who's described as a onirokritos, so she's a dream interpreter, and that's not really a title you see very often in Greek religion. It's also something that you would need to know how to do. So there's some suggestion that she's trained in this somehow. There's people who are responsible for some interesting festivals, or somebody like Eritrea who's in charge of bringing the boat to the Pleophesia, which is her springtime festival. So that's another sort of big part of the body of research on Isis, particularly among European scholars, has been what is the deal with all of these seemingly hyper-specialized cult functions, and what does that tell us about the relationship with the Egyptian cult practice?
Okay, great. And then there's, of course, more of the material evidence, the mosaics, the statues, the images, and we'll definitely come back to that. But one thing that I do want to ask you is, as you point out early on in the book, that the work on Isis, especially monograph length work on Isis, has tended to be rooted in kind of Rome. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the Greek, or like the Greece under Rome side of things, was relatively neglected?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, one is the perpetual Pompeii problem, which is that we have all this great material from Pompeii, and so everyone gets excited about that, and that the Roman material is a little bit more forefronted. Another problem is just the perpetual sort of misunderstanding or disinterest in the Roman period and the history and archaeology of Greece. That's a period that, apart from in Macedonia, has been largely ignored for a variety of reasons. Obviously, you know the various sort of historiographies of classical archaeology. The later periods are generally of lesser interest to both Western scholars and scholars in Greece as well. And I will say that's quite different in Macedonia, where there's a language barrier. The tendency has been to publish in Greek, and not everyone learns Greek. I do think the other problem, though, is that this idea that Egyptian religion and Egyptian influence and Egyptian migrants are so prominent in Greek culture is a problem for our understanding of Greece. It's a problem for our very pure ideological sort of model of what Greece was. And that's something that's certainly changing a lot now with the growing interest in particularly migration studies and Roman Greek studies as well. That's something that's really blossomed in the last several years. But it's something that's sort of been a problem for previous models, and I think that's part of why this question was left open to me when I came to it.
Yeah, maybe I guess on the Rome side it's a little more obvious too, because Augustus actually does conquer Egypt, so it's sort of...
Oh yeah, and he definitely wants you to know that.
Right. Okay, so there's some lower hanging fruit in some ways there. But let me ask you, because you're primarily interested in this is back to what you were saying at the beginning when you realized the book that you did want to write.
Mm-hmm.
You're really interested in these questions of ethnicity and how ethnicity and identity are being defined in this context. I think that a lot of people who think of the Second Sophistic think of it in precisely those terms, that this is a period in which there's a lot of idealizing, even like fetishism around some fantasy of what classical Athens was, that you see a lot of the classical forms revived in terms of genre. You see, obviously Atticizing in terms of the language. You even see in terms of, school exercises, sort of like, imagine that you are this commander at Marathon, what do you do if, so there's this kind of like this element of people's minds being somewhere else and that else being classical Athens that we get from, I think, one stream of the surviving literature. Where do the devotees of Isis and Serapis fit in relation to that other narrative, the more taught narrative, I guess, of the Second Sophistic? Where is this something that is, from an intellectual perspective, if not just a popularity perspective, that is marginal? Are the male elites that you're kind of using a little bit as a foil here, are they actively trying to suppress or ignore this stuff? Or are they just not interested? How are these streams positioned in terms of each other?
Well, I think that a lot of these male elites are really excited, interested in Egypt, and that's a big portion of one of the chapters of my book talks about Herodes Atticus, who's, of course, this deeply central figure to the Second Sophistic, clearly very excited about Egyptian cult. If he's not a practitioner of it, I'd be shocked to find that he wasn't an Isis devotee himself, given the number of Egyptian sanctuaries he probably had on his own personal property. But I think that there's also the sense, too, what often happens when someone writes a really good, exciting book like Tim Whitmarsh's is that it can kind of focalize things on one particular body of evidence. Mm-hmm. And so the Second Sophistic, we have to remember, is a very small, as you mentioned, very elite, very male group. They're just one small group. We just have a lot of text. They wrote a lot. They had a lot to say. And so I think that they are part of the conversation, but we, as scholars, we tend to sometimes get so excited about one book that we kind of forget that that's just one body of evidence. So one book can really point us in an interesting direction, but can also kind of shape discourse in ways that are really productive, but also sometimes lead us to be a little bit blind. So I think in many ways, Second Sophistic Studies has really been interested in this playing with time, which I actually think is a key part of what's going on with the Egyptian cults as well. But we haven't asked whether there are other narratives that are running at the same time. And that's a big part of what I think my book is trying to do, is show that there is another narrative. There's a narrative about Greece kind of owning and controlling Egypt. There's a narrative about Greek identity being able to reach back into this sort of atemporal myth time, Homeric time, as well as the classical Athens time. But not everyone really wants Greekness to just be a Greekness that's limited to Athens, but they might want a more universal Greekness as well.
Could you say a little bit more about, what you think is going on here in terms of temporality? Because this is a rubric that people are very interested in right now. Mm-hmm. And actually, in an earlier episode of this podcast, I had Emma Greensmith and Tim Whitmarsh on. Emma just edited this new handbook to ancient epic, and a lot of the materials is imperial, and so they were talking a lot about imperial epic and the way that it plays with temporalities, precisely this kind of reaching into the Homeric past but being atemporal, but also doing this and also doing that. So I think it's something that people are interested in. So could you maybe what are the thoughts that you were gesturing to, I guess?
One of the things that I think the epigraphic evidence points to is a desire to put Isis among the Homeric deities and to put her in some of the very earliest myths that exist in Greek literature. So one of the one from Maronia and Thrace, for example, really expends like multiple lines of putting her into the Eleusinian Demeter myth. Triptolemus gets called out as sort of her servant, and she's the one that's actually telling him to go and sow the fields. And, a lot of these literary textual components as well are playing it up. But if we look at it also from a sculptural and religious practice angle, Isis has to have a new image made for her. There's no existing tradition that she can kind of pull upon. So how do they make an Isis? They essentially take existing models from other female deities, Hygeia, Aphrodite, less so Demeter here. There are other provinces where the Demeter model is more prominent. And they put Isis's costume and give her a couple things to hold in her hands, and that's how they make an Isis. And so that's a way that they're fitting her in. When she's being worshipped, she's very often being placed next to, she'll usually have a Serapis with her, but she'll very often have, in the next alcove over Aphrodite or some other very canonical Greek deity. And a lot of that epigraphy from particularly some of the early sanctuaries, like the one at Thessaloniki, you see a lot of epigraphic descriptions of two Isis and Serapis and the Syneoi Theoi or the Symbomoi Theoi, which other scholars like Eshleman have pointed out that this is actually a way that you integrate a new deity and you make that deity work within the existing pantheon. We see the same language being used in early dedications to Asclepius in Athens, for example. So there's a lot of different strategies that they use to kind of make Isis work in this really early myth tradition. And so they're not reaching back to classical Athens in order to make this work. It probably wouldn't have been effective. So the time period that they're reaching for is that Homeric time. But Homeric time also, I think, as you mentioned, doesn't really exist on like a chronological human time frame. It exists in this very deep, murky mythological past that allows you to be very fertile and very creative in the ways that you're redefining your deities. So I think that here the temporality needs to be Homeric, because obviously if anything in Greek culture, if you can relate something to Homer, you win. But also the sense, too, that the temporality needs to be so amorphous because it needs to be something original, primeval, in order to really justify the prominence they want to give her.
When is the acme of Isis worship in the Greek world? What are our geographic termini, and when is she at her peak?
In terms of geography in the Roman Empire, she's basically everywhere. We have sanctuaries to her on the Hadrian's Wall, Bactria. She's all over the place. She's extremely popular. Pretty much any city you can think of is going to have some sanctuary or altar to her. In terms of temporality, she starts appearing in Greece, in the Greek world, in the late 4th century. There are earlier sanctuaries to her, like in the 5th century. Like there's the one in Athens that's mentioned in an inscription as existing for Egyptian migrants at Piraeus. And there's another one that's up in Halkidiki that's dedicated to Zeus Ammon that's in the 5th century as well. And those sanctuaries do seem to serve Egyptian migrant communities. What happens in the 4th century is a little bit more murky. There's something that Ian Moyer talks a little bit about in his book, which is that it seems like in the first iterations of these cults, they are meant for Egyptian migrant communities who are living in port cities. But pretty quickly, within about 50 years, you probably have significant portions of people who are not from Egypt, so from various parts of the Greek-speaking world, who are coming in to join the cult. Some of them are Delians. Delos is sort of the easiest place to study this because of the way that its epigraphic record is so well studied and preserved. But it's very possible you also have Syrians and Italians play a really big role in the cult starting in the 2nd century BC.
So, and then what is the decline of it? Can that be pegged to the same sort of narrative of decline of the Olympians?
I think so. You have sanctuaries that are really very active through the 3rd century. You have people coming in and out of certain sanctuaries in the 4th century, dropping coins here and there. But you also have, at various points, there's several sanctuaries where we have evidence that a lot of the sculpture is buried at some point, that it's taken down and buried. This happens at Marathon very famously. They just tip them off their bases and cover them up. It happened at Messini, probably happens at Thessaloniki and Rhodes as well. So the question sort of becomes, what's the rationale behind that?
in this kind of, religious ecosystem, where does the worship of Isis and Serapis fit in vis-a-vis like other what we would call maybe mystery cults? I'm thinking of, what people loosely call Orphism, like the Orphic lamellae, that kind of business, which is kind of long-lived. Similarly, can you be into Orphism and be into Isis?
There's no reason you can't. We have evidence of people at various sites being priests of Isis one year and then usually more canonical Greek deity the next. It's not super common, but there are a few, and that's also probably more of a function of the fact that we just don't have inscriptions. There aren't that many people for whom we have multiple inscriptions. I can't think of anyone any evidence of someone doing both, like Bacchic cults and isiaques cults. I can't think of one. I did actually look at this at Ostia, where you do have a really large active Mithras community and a Kybele community and a Serapis and Isis community. And there was an overlap there, which was surprising to me. I was expecting to see some overlap, but it does seem like that people were kind of picking their one mystery deity and then, probably still engaged with sort of traditional or canonical religion, especially since it's such a key driver of social life. But it didn't seem like people were, just a mystery cult person where they were doing all three.
And then what is going on the ground in Egypt at this time in terms of the worship of Isis? Is there kind of a back and forth? Are the traditions evolving alongside of each other, or how are Egyptians themselves worshiping Isis over this span of time?
I think there's a bit of both happening. There's still a lot of conservatism. The big temples are still active, and still requiring imperial patronage. There are small scale shifts, but it doesn't seem like there are, from my understanding, and I won't pretend to be an expert in what's going on in Egypt at this time. It doesn't seem like there's huge sort of movement back from these outlying areas into affecting the development of Egyptian cult there. But there is a lot of, I know there's people who've done work on the terracottas, and there does seem to be some back influence, so to speak, in terms of what Isis looks like and what other deities look like that kind of comes in across the Hellenistic and Roman periods.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to continue to ask my very basic level questions as we go here. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the methodological framework that you use for getting at this concept of ethnicity. So you are guided by Rogers Brubaker's Ethnicity Without Groups, and that forms the scaffolding, I guess, for your table of contents. Could you speak a little bit about that methodological framework?
For me, as I was looking through this, since the driving question was around Greekness, I wanted to have a methodology and a way to think through the fact that Isis is Egyptian, and that ethnic portion of her is fundamental to who she is. It's fundamental to what we want from her. It's fundamental to how the Greek texts and images are conceiving of her. But they do see some sort of tension and conflict with traditional modes of Greekness that needs to be resolved in some capacity or another. And I, in doing so, I was also really attracted to this problem of how do we get at ethnicity, given that we can't ask the kinds of questions that modern scholars of ethnicity would ask, or we don't have that kind of evidence. So Brubaker's work was really helpful for me in terms of thinking about different ways that people are making choices around how to experience ethnicity, how to define it, how to make it work, and that it didn't, in particularly Brubaker's insistence on not bounding those identities, on saying that, it's not going to be grouped in a lot of ways, because what I was trying to do is really splice off in a small portion of Greeks that are defining themselves in a religious manner that is also ethnically inflected. And so Brubaker's also, his evidence pool was the Balkans, and so a lot of that book is really about the Balkan Wars. Sorry, not Balkan Wars, the Balkan crisis of the 90s, the Bosnian and Serbian wars. And so obviously this thing I'm talking about here is not about violence. I'm not looking at a situation where Greeks are slaughtering wholesale, Egyptian cult devotees, but it was helpful to think about how these people have a political identity, a social identity, a religious identity, an ethnic identity, and how those all kind of parse together. And so I found the three concepts to be really useful questions to ask of particular bodies of evidence to get at this difficult to untangle overlap between different forms of identity that I did think oriented the way that they experienced their ideas of Greece's place in the Mediterranean and Greece's place in the Roman world.
Yeah, could you just speak a little bit about what ultimately you found using this framework? I mean, and I'm particularly interested in perhaps what surprised you or what maybe assumptions that you took into the project that you felt you had to rethink as the work went on.
I think when I first started the book, I had no intention of writing about anything with geography. And over time, it became clear that geography was really key. I had not intended to write a landscape chapter of this book. Chapter 6 is the one that got away from me in a lot of exciting and fun ways, but it's also the one that's the longest. And so that usually means that the chapter got away from you a little bit. And for me, as I was looking at a lot of these sanctuaries, I'm really allergic to mosquitoes. I have a real problem, and I kept getting frustrated because I would go to my sites to work and I would just leave and I would be covered in mosquito bites. And Greek allergy medicine is very different from American allergy medicine. I would just be laid up for days. And then that made me, like, I had this, as I was sitting there in whatever the Greek equivalent of Benadryl fog was, I was like, oh, a big part of what's happening here is they're placing these things in very specific sites. They're not just shoving them in the middle of the agora like you would do for an Artemis temple. They're finding the marshiest spot they can possibly think of to put their Isis sanctuary in. And
it's very appropriate that you have this psychedelic epiphany. Right,
Right. Thank you, Greek allergy medicine. I need to learn the brand name of that,
obviously. Like some sort of psychotropic. Okay.
Would not recommend this as a normal way to pursue academic inquiry, but it is the way that this came to me for me. And so it was really interesting to think about, okay, so they've chosen spots to place these sanctuaries, or they've, built constructions to bring lots of water in. And what does that create as a somatic effect, as a sensory effect, as a geographical construct? And around the same time that this was happening, I had written to Katie Barrett, who published a great book on landscapes in Pompeian gardens, and she very generously shared that with me. And I noticed that she had some very similar ideas there, which suggested that the sensory effect was a really big component of how people conceived of Egypt. And again, as I mentioned, it's really difficult to say to find any kind of separation between Egypt as a physical landscape and these deities. And so that kind of led me down the path of thinking about how important Egypt as a place, as a territory, and the imagination around Egypt played into the ways that these Greek people wanted to construct Isis. They had to build a home for her, and they chose to bring in as much of the Nile as they could plausibly pull off, in Egypt and in Greece in so many instances. Whether it's building a fake Nilometer for a river that's not there, a flood that's not actually happening, whether it's, placing it somewhere that's going to have that very marshy affect, whether it's painting something on the walls. We don't have a lot of evidence for that because the wall painting evidence really is difficult to come by outside of Pompeii and the Herculean.
Probably especially in super damp places.
Yeah, that probably didn't help either. But it also got me thinking, too, about possibilities with things like plants, with things like animals, and other ways that they could really dial up the exoticism.
Right. And make sure that Isis isn't homesick in her new atmosphere.
Wouldn't want her to get lonely.
So how are people using their worship of Isis to construct a version of Greekness?
Well, I think a big part of it is they've centralized themselves as someone who can consume and control these outlying places. Egypt is in many ways, even today, the ultimate other, the ultimate sort of exotic fantasy. And so being able to make yourself a mini Egypt that you can have in your city and then just kind of walk out, to have it be something so controllable is a very power grab. It's a big power grab. It's a way to centralize yourself. It's a way to make yourself feel more important and more central to this sense of imperialism. There's ways in which they are putting on new forms of Egyptian identity with the costumes, and sort of trying to deal with problems of how can we express our importance on both a local and sort of a global level, which is where one of my discussions in chapter 5, where I talk about the funerary reliefs, they find ways to translate and sort of negotiate that balance between Isis having this Egyptian home, this Egyptian background, and rendering her in Greek materials and Greek styles. And so there's a lot of ways in which what they're really trying to do is they're trying to make Egypt part of the Greek history, part of the Greek deep past, and in doing so say that they can control both Egypt and sort of their own place in the Mediterranean world. I think that what we're looking at here is a way for these Greeks who are largely disempowered under the Roman Empire to claim power over somebody else.
And this seems to be the case kind of like in terms of the practice across the Greek world.
Yes, I mean, it's a cult that doesn't have a ton of, it's not centrally controlled. There's a lot of variety in place to place, but there do seem to be consistent themes across the Greek world where people, this version of Isis that serves this very specific political and ideological purpose, and also serves a really important part in redefining these key facets of Greek identity come together.
And so what is the level of, even if it's not centrally organized, what is the level of community that you can detect amongst devotees?
There's a couple different things you can see. One is that you can see connections between different sites because you can see different, particularly among the Italians, once they leave Delos, they go to particular places. You can see them bringing things that they were doing on Delos into these new locations, and those ties seem to persist across several different sites. There are ways in which it gets sort of mapped onto other forms of identity, particularly family. So there are a couple places where you can see different members of a family sort of appearing in the same cult, so the cult becomes sort of something that people in this family do. There are a couple places where priesthoods are handed down father to son, which is not the norm in most Greek religious contexts. But also coming back to these hymns, which are, kind of obviously one of my favorite parts of evidence that I got to deal with, Ian Moyer has demonstrated that they're actually punctuated in the same way, and they're spread among all these different communities, which does suggest that they are some sort of copying of these texts that are coming around, that there's some sort of standardization of ritual that they're connected to, and that they are in some ways knitting together these various communities into some sort of a shared religious practice. And there's also like little myths. There's this great inscription from Thessaloniki that sort of describes this guy, Xenitos, coming in, learning about the cult from a magic dream, and then going back to Oropos and founding the sanctuary there. So you can also see sort of mother sanctuaries and daughter sanctuaries popping up to further connect those cultures together, those cult groups together.
How would you say then that the version of Greekness or Greek identity constructed in the context of the Isis and to a certain extent the Serapis cultic context, like how is that then contrasting with some standard kind of male elite identity narrative that maybe we're used to from the particular texts that we've looked at for a long time, or the stories we've told ourselves about those texts?
So you're interested in sort of how these visions complicate our ideas of how like standard elite male identity come together?
Well, I guess because the way you kind of frame it in the book is that the way that the devotees consider Greek ethnicity is standing somehow in contrast to maybe hegemonic male elite narrative. And I guess I'm just wondering what exactly is the essence of that actual contrast? Like, why isn't domination of Egypt something that works for the hegemonic elite male narrative? It seems from that perspective it might be a pretty good thing. So I guess what is the essence then of the contrast?
It's a good question. So I don't think that there's necessarily a fully distinct contrast and that these people want something really different. I think that they're just framing it in a different way rather than kind of pushing back to a pure Greek past. They're pushing back to a more universal Greek past. So the things that they want are more explicitly outward focused. They're more explicitly interested in sort of claiming a whole lot more sort of territorial centrality for themselves and religious centrality for themselves. So I think in many ways it operates in a very similar way. The Isis cult is not liberatory. It's not feminist. It's not it's not doing any of that kind of work. What I think it's doing is sort of offering a slightly different way to get at a lot of the same things. And we do know that there are a lot of elite men who are involved in this cult. There are a lot of elite women to a lesser extent. That women are not often given priesthoods. But the cult itself is still very much operating within sort of the norms of Greco-Roman religion and Greco-Roman culture, and particularly Roman culture in a lot of ways. So it's offering something, a slightly different perspective on a lot of the same wants.
So is it just to understand, if we put at one end of the spectrum some extremely rigorous Atticizing of language and thought and education and all that kind of stuff, that's one way of doing Greekness, again, under Rome.
Yeah.
But this then is a very different way, which is sort of saying, no, everything there ever was, in a way, can be understood under this rubric of the kind of all-encompassing Greekness.
I think that's a really good way to put it, because the one sort of big contrast that we might note here is a lot of the rhetoric, like Aeschylus and stuff, does play a lot really heavily into, you need to be concerned about whether your children are getting foreign influences. And we get a lot of that sort of autochthony myth coming back up. And so this idea of reaching into the past and saying, well, actually, we're also kind of Egyptian, does kind of challenge that a bit. It does problematize it a little bit. But ultimately, I think what they're doing is going towards the same ends, which is ultimately Greece still comes out on top and as the most central and most important thing that's operating in the Roman world.
So it's still, in both cases, it's a way still of a soft resistance of the Roman imperial regime.
I think that's a good way to frame it.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the material evidence, because I think that these statues are always very exciting. What do we see in terms of the way that Isis is actually visually depicted? Particularly in terms of this cultural syncretism, or whatever you want to call it, the Greekness and the Egyptianness coming together.
So Isis in many ways doesn't look super Egyptian unless you kind of know what you're looking at. I remember my advisor and I were in the National Museum, and she's one of the great scholars of Hellenistic and Roman sculpture in Greece, and we were standing in front of an Isis statue that's in one of those rooms that most people speed through. And she's like, well, what about this is actually Isis? To give you a sense of how much they really do want these things to fit into existing models. Her most identifiable trait, and this is what you see often in the funerary reliefs, is she'll have her mantle knotted in between her breasts to create this very characteristic, it's either like a lambda or an X shape. The X is a little bit more popular, with like a big rose-like knot right in between the breasts. And what that does actually is allows these women and Isis herself to be a lot more active in pose, because most Greek bodies for women that are available in sculpture, they have to be like literally holding their clothes on. They're like grabbing onto their drapery to keep it from slipping off. And so here you can actually see them. They're often holding a rattle and shaking it and holding onto this little breast-shaped pail called a situla. So these are actually kind of interesting from a representation of women perspective, because these women actually get to do something and have an action, a verb, so to speak. Isis also often has like these very thick, almost like corkscrew curls. That comes out of the Egyptian iconography. And the knotting also sometimes produces this, I call it a chevron shape, that goes over the bottom half of the body. Isis herself can wear a variety of Egyptian-inspired crowns. Some of them have like the little cobra, uraeus on there. Sometimes you get the double crown of Egypt. That's more often put on males. Sometimes you get like feathers of Ma'at. So those are, borrowing iconographically from Egyptian art as well. But the bodies themselves are done almost always in a very contemporary style. So they look contemporary. They look very Greek. Her face will be the same as a statue of Artemis or Aphrodite. Her clothing follows mostly sexual mores. It goes down to the plinth. It's covering her body. You can see her breasts, but you can't see like all the way through like you would with a statue of Aphrodite. And so she's really quite close in a lot of ways to a lot of Greek deities. And what's also kind of interesting is that they choose pretty much exclusively to depict these Egyptian deities in Greek marble. There are other places in the Western Empire where you have a lot of imported objects kicking around the sanctuary. We have very few in Greece for whatever reason. They chose not to import stones. They chose not to import even little faience things most of the time, which is pretty unusual. You only see those in very early sanctuaries.
How then does the Isis iconography that you described, in terms of the statues, translate into, say, grave reliefs in Roman Athens? And I think that people would be surprised to hear just how many there are that are marking or commemorating the deaths of devotees of Isis in Roman Athens.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of them. There's over 100. I think I counted 111. And it's about 20% of the known corpus, which is huge. It's clearly a very popular and very effective strategy. And one of the things that was interesting to me in looking at this is thinking about what is the connection between these women and the cult themselves. I do think that there is a connection between them. I think that women are picking up this costume because they are involved in the cult, and perhaps even it's possibly part of that sort of initiation process I referenced with the first and second person hymns and their recitation. But what was also interesting to me was thinking about them from a provincial perspective, thinking about the fact that we have only like one or two men that use them, and they're very clearly like bad experiments. And in fact, it's almost exclusively women. Oh, they're bad. There's some weird hands, weird straps. And so I was looking sort of across the empire, and there's a very discernible pattern, which is that women wear what we might call non-normative dress in much higher numbers than men do. Men very rarely do. Outside of only in Palmyra do you really see it. And so women are very often, or not very often, but it's always available, and in some places and times it's a popular option to wear what's often described as indigenous dress in the West. And so I was asking sort of, what about this possibility of indigenous dress here in Greece, where their dresses sort of become universalized and become pulled away from their sort of locality and be something that everyone wears? And so I was thinking of this as potentially a provincial response, as a way to show local connection, local power, local prominence in this religious context, as well as sort of empire-wide excellence with the sort of canonical dress of the men. And that pushed me towards thinking about this broader problem of not really being able to identify the things that are Roman, things that change under Roman power in the Eastern Mediterranean. I just don't think we have good heuristics for understanding and identifying those changes, because they don't look as dramatic or as clear as what we've seen in the West, and we haven't really solved that interpretive problem.
Yeah, I think it becomes a problem or a challenge in so many different places, this way that we're used to thinking about Athens as normative. Mm-hmm. And so then what you're suggesting is that, sometimes it's helpful to look at it as, what it was in this period, is as a province, as a place where there's potential for regionalism, regional variation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess my last big question then, Linny, is, since you mentioned the female dress and, the ways that there are far fewer of these, what you call these experiments in the male non-normative dress, what did you find in terms of light that the evidence sheds on gender and the gender distribution, perhaps, of devotees, how the worship of Isis itself is gendered?
It's disappointing evidence, I think, in a lot of ways, because we think of Isis oftentimes with the sort of 70s history of neo-paganism, and Isis is this liberatory feminist goddess. Particularly the Greek evidence shows, again, that very few women get to hold central priesthoods, even in tandem with male relatives or husbands. There's just fewer mentions of women in the cults, in the epigraphy, which just tracks with the epigraphic habit generally across the Mediterranean in this period.
Sorry, so why are they so overrepresented in the grave reliefs? Is this really just this matter of dress, do you think, or? My
argument is that they need to be there because the men need to wear the normative costume. They have to do that work.
So it is that, yeah.
And so the women are there to hold, the bodies are literally to hold this non-normative costume, to say we are important in this local scale, in this local community, as well as Mediterranean wide, in kind of the same way you might see, a woman in Pannonia wearing indigenous dress next to her husband in a toga. That is really more a statement about the family and the family's importance on these multiple scales than it is a real direct connection, a description of the woman's personal religious beliefs.
Right, so the guy's always in a suit, and then the woman kind of gets to do her thing a little bit more.
Yeah. Although I do think these women are probably devotees or meant to be understood as initiates in some capacity.
Well, thank you, Linny, so much for this. All that remains is the podcast word association game. So I'm just going to throw a couple terms out there, and I'm just going to ask you to respond whatever comes to mind first. Don't overthink it.
Okay.
Don't even think about it at all. So the first one is second sophistic.
Ooh, I think of time. I think of this like sort of connection to this grasping at the material of the past and wanting to present it and hold it and put it at the forefront. I also think of weirdness. I love second sophistic literature because it's so weird. I could spend the rest of my life just reading Plutarch's Moralia and like have a really good time.
Well, always nice to have something to do. All right, Roman Athens.
Oh, Roman Athens is Pentelic in so many ways. It is, I always think of it as retconning, and I always think of it as rewriting history. I like it the way it rewrites history.
How about Serapis?
Great beard, solid beard, one of the best beards in ancient sculpture. And good hat. My husband always makes jokes that I wrote a book about a god with a flower pot in his head. And he's often shown in Greek sculpture with a really cute little Cerberus who's very charming.
You and I are both dog people.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a really cute Cerberus. It's not like a mean Cerberus. It's really cute.
Like Cerberus in Chaos. Did you see Chaos?
Yes, very much of that ilk.
Very cute Cerberus. All right, Nilotica.
I think of plants, ducks. There's always ducks in Nilotica, which is very funny to me because I don't think of ducks as being especially Egyptian, but apparently the Romans did. I think of imagination. I think of hypersexuality and abundance and luxury and
mosquitoes.
Growth. And mosquitoes and my deep allergy for mosquitoes.
And finally, Isis.
Oh, Isis is everything to everyone all of the time. She's miraculous. She's got some very good hair, and she's also, I think, quite luxurious and quite bountiful in a lot of ways.
Well, thanks, Linny. I think people are going to be really interested to, have heard about this material from you. The subtitle of your book, I noticed, has got Egyptian, Greek, and Roman in it. So like Isis herself, your work has something for everyone. So thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It was really fun to chat.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.